Hey, this is Malcolm341. In this video, we're going to look at how MIP mapping works and the best settings to use for texture padding in the UV editor. Correct texture padding is a must for any good UV pack, so let's get into it. Okay, so what are MIP maps and how do they relate to texture padding in the UV editor? MIP maps are a sequence of images contained within a texture, each of which is a progressively lower resolution representation of the same image. This is what MIP maps look like. The height and width of each image in the mipmap is a power of 2 and is smaller than the previous image in the sequence. The name MIP is an acronym of the Latin phrase multum in parvo, meaning much in little. I guess the programmer that invented this thought it was appropriate because multiple images are packed into one texture and then compressed to save disk space. So yeah, much in little makes sense. Latin, so fancy. Mipmaps are used to increase rendering speed and reduce aliasing artifacts on textures far away from the camera or at oblique angles. Very confusing. So let's look at what this all actually means. Okay, so the best place to demonstrate this is actually in Marmoset Toolbag. So basically what happens is I have my texture applied here. And when you have mipmaps generated for the texture, what's going to happen is it is going to switch to the lower resolution texture at oblique angles or as the camera gets farther away from the object. So as you can see here, I zoom out and everything's great. There's no aliasing happening with the texture and it looks normal. And it's actually getting blurrier as it gets farther away from the eye. And this is to simulate how the real world works. So basically in the real world, when you look at something really far away, it's not crisp and aliasing and all like dancing around and sparkling. It gets blurry as things get farther away from your eye. And so to simulate this in video games, we use this technique called MIP mapping. Now watch what happens when I turn MIP mapping off. So I'm just going to go into this gear icon here and you can say use MIPs off. Okay, so everything looks fine up close. But now if you watch the oblique angles here, you'll see how they start to shimmer and sparkle? See here, it's getting all sparkly when I move the camera like that. That's because the resolution of the texture is too high to represent like how many pixels on screen and screen space it has. Now watch when I zoom the camera out. See, everything's good. But see, as I get farther away, you'll start to see a moire pattern. Everything's starting to shimmer and look really crappy. And then here, look how bad this gets. So really far away objects are obviously the worst. Look, see all that flickering and banding and aliasing and moire that's happening there. That's, again, because the texture is a 2K texture, but it's only being displayed on screen at like, I don't know what that is, 32 pixels or something like that. And so it doesn't know what to do. And so it just freaks out and creates all this crazy like flickering crap all over the screen. And so obviously like that's not what you want to see. And so the solution for that was to come up with the idea of loading smaller textures as the object, blending between smaller textures as the object gets farther away from the camera. And believe it or not, when I first got into making 3D art for video games, this was the norm. So I started working on the PlayStation 2, and the PlayStation 2 wasn't powerful enough not only to render the shader correctly, but it didn't have enough memory. Like memory was very scarce back then. And so you couldn't store the extra scaled down textures to do the blending. So this is actually what games would look like when I first started working in the industry, and this was the norm. You would just get farther away from objects, and they would alias to shit and look terrible. So we've come a long way in terms of graphics quality, even since like 2001. So you can see how important MIPs are. So see all that sparkly shit here. I'm just going to re-enable them. Use MIPs on, and you can see there. See, it's already smoothed out. So off, on, off, on. Leave that on. And then when I move around, nothing happens. It's a nice smooth transition. Everything looks great. Magic. Modern game technology is the best. You might not know it, but probably every texture you've ever made has mipmaps in it. Most render engines will automatically generate mipmaps inside of your texture when you import it into programs like Unreal or Marmoset Toolbag or Unity or Maya or pretty much anything at this point. This all happens behind the scenes for the most part, so in the modern age of game making, you don't really need to worry about mipmaps. But you do need to understand them to set texture padding settings correctly in the UV editor. If you want to look at what your textures look like with MIPs, you can download this plugin for Photoshop and save your textures as DXT1. I'll explain DXT compression in another video. I'll put the link for the plugin in the description as well. So to check your file it with MIPS here, let's just go to do a file save as of the texture. Let's put it wherever you want to choose after you've installed the plugin, the DDS format here. I'm going to call this test so I can find it, whatever. Okay, and then it's going to pop open this window, this ancient window, and you're just going to want to do the top option for the sake of this, and you want to say generate MIPS, obviously. Okay, and then save it. Okay, and then I just have to close this, and then I just need to go and open that file. So I saved it into the rough textures here, so I'm just going to drag it in, and it's going to pop open this options box here, and you want to, whoops, that probably off by default, but you want to turn that on, load MIPS, and say okay, and boom, there you go. So this is what your actual texture looks like in a game engine or in things like a render engine like Marmoset Toolbag or something like that. You've got your basically your source image here, 2K by 2K image, and then it automatically goes in and scales down each one of these guys for you. So in a power of 2, so basically half each time. So you got your 2K, 1K, 512, 256, 128, so on and so forth, all the way down. Here, let me just zoom in all the way down to 1 pixel. And that's how the whole system works to actually blur out your texture as you get farther away from it to fix all of those aliasing errors that we see when we turn mipmaps off. But like I said, you don't really need to worry about mipmaps anymore. You just need to understand that your texture gets compressed and MIPs are added to it when you import it into Unreal, for example. Okay, so now that we understand MIP mapping, let's look at how it relates to texture padding. So what texture padding means is the space between UV shells and how many pixels that is. So for example, in a 2048 by 2048 texture, if I lay out UVs and set texture padding to 4 pixels, each UV shell will be 4 pixels apart from the shell beside it. The goal in texture padding is to have the smallest space between UV shells as possible. The reason for that is if you pad your shells too far apart, you lose resolution in the texture. I've seen terrible padding coming from some artists. I've seen people use 32 pixels of padding to unwrap a prop on a 2K texture. That is crazy. You're throwing away so much resolution just in the padding before you even do a proper UV layout. Okay, let's look at a quick shell padding example here. Just go into the UV editor and right hold click, go to modify, and then find layout and go into the options box here. Just do a reset here, and then I'm just going to set the texture map size to 2K because that's what I have applied. And then here you can control the shell padding and the tile padding. What shell padding is the distance between the UV shells, and the tile padding is the distance from the edge of the texture, basically the 0 to 1 UV space. So let's say I put in 32 pixels, whoops, that's 23, 32 pixels of shell padding. So watch what happens here. So I've got my 32 pixels of shell padding, that's great. But as I reduce space there, I'm actually losing resolution here. So let's also put 32 into the edge stuff there. Okay, so that might not seem too bad, but here, let's look at an extreme example. Let's go like 500 and 500, just to get the point across here. So see how I've added all the padding here, and then, oh, my texture looks like crap here. So when you're working in the games industry, texture resolution is gold. Like you're always trying to get the highest resolution possible. And if you're padding things out to 64 pixels or something, or 32 pixels, you're throwing away a percentage of your texture just in the space between UV shells. And then I'm just going to open up like another window here that'll make it really clear. So let's go up into here and go to view. And we're going to go to the heads up display, and then we're going to go to the UV statistics. So you want to turn that on, and then you want to go to the options box here. We'll just reset it back to default, and then you can turn on percentage of used UV space. This is super powerful, and hit apply. And down here, it's going to tell you how much UV space is used. So you get a percent number there, right? And so if you can imagine, there is a direct correlation between the amount of shell padding that you do, for example. Let's put in a shell padding of 0 and hit apply. And you can see we've got 66% usage. This is a weird case just because it doesn't pack into like a square or whatever, so you can ignore that. It's all wasted space. but we've got 66% used UV space. And then if we were to put something in like 32 pixels or 32 pixels and hit apply, you're actually going to see we've wasted a bunch of UV space just in the edge padding there. So this is a really good way to know whether you're on track for a good UV layout or not. At my job, we have a minimum of 70%. So if we see a UV pack and it is less than 70%, we have to ask the artist to redo it because it's unacceptable to waste all of that UV space either through poor padding or just bad UV layout choices in general. So anywhere between 70% and 85%, that's like a natural kind of good UV layout, good UV pack. And now you might ask, well, why don't I just put 1 pixel of padding or 0 pixels of padding, save some space, and make everything super efficient? I'm glad you asked that question. The reason is because of texture bleeding and mipmaps. So because we use mipmaps, if we texture right to the UV border edge and don't leave any space between UV shells, we'll see texture bleed as the object gets further away from the camera. So here you can see I've padded out my UV shells here and my texture. I've got gray to represent where the texture is, and the background color is red for demonstration purposes in this example. And you can zoom in here, everything's good. And then you can see I've got a gray cube here, all good. But when I bring this into Marmoset Toolbag, you can see I've got these weird kind of red edges here. And you'll see as I zoom out, the red edge problem will get even worse. The edges will start to get thicker. And the red edges are visible in Marmoset Toolbag because this viewport simulates more like a real game render engine compared to what Maya's viewport does. So you'll see this kind of error if you bring the asset into Unity or Marmoset Toolbag or Unreal or whatever. To solve this, we need a little bit of extra texture that actually extends past the UV border edge. So here, gray is our texture and red is our background color, and the white line is the UV shell. So we need to actually extend that texture out a little bit there to compensate for the mipmapping. And that's usually referred to as dilation or texture padding. So to do that, I'm just going to quickly go into Photoshop here, and I've got an example set up. So this is my texture in Photoshop. Just zoom into one part of it there. And then I've just extruded those border pixels out a little bit so you can see that's with my dilation off and that's with it on. So I'm just going to save the texture here and we'll go back into Maya. And so now you can see that's where my UV border edge ended and that's where all my texture happens. And then I need to dilate out from that point to get a little bit of edge there to stop it from bleeding over when it mips down to a lower resolution. And then let's jump in over into Marmoset Toolbag. And boom, there, solved. Fix that problem. And then you'll see when I zoom out, the problem will always occur to some degree because we're talking about mipping down to like a single pixel, but you want to solve it as much as possible given like a reasonable amount of pixel wastage between your UV shells versus like acceptable texture bleed. So this is like well in the acceptable texture bleed range. Because the other thing too is we're not going to have red. You don't actually ever want to have red or black or pure white or any high contrast color as your background color. You want to dilate the texture out fully. So in this example, if it was an actual texture that we were making, there'd be no red because we would dilate out 100% to gray. And to answer the original question, why we can't have 0 space or 1 pixel of UV space, here, let's just take a look. So I'm just going to go into UV mode here. I'm just going to scale these down to 0 space, for example, and scale these guys down to 0 space. Let's zoom in here. And so we've got 0 space between our shells. So you can see these guys are all just sitting on top of each other. Now, to fix the original problem, we want to extend the gray pixel past the UV border edge. But if we've already left no space there, there's no way that I can extend the gray and extend the gray and extend the gray and extend the gray past any one of these white lines. And so as I zoom out, I won't have any bleeding room there for the texture to scale down to a lower resolution, and therefore we'll always get kind of UV border edge seams. Now, of course, because this is a fully gray texture, that wouldn't be a big deal. But in a real texture, you're going to have different information on each side of each UV shell, so to speak. So we talked earlier about 32 pixels being way too much space and wasting a bunch of resolution. And then what the magic number would be for the spacing between these that would give you enough space to pad out, but still give you the most efficient UV packs. And that number is 8 pixels. So the distance between these two UV shells on a 2048 by 2048 texture should be about 8 pixels. If you can hit it right on the nose, great. What's going to happen though when you do your UV layout, it's kind of inaccurate, and some shells are going to be stacked a little bit closer and some are going to be stacked a little bit wider. So what I would aim for is I would aim for a space of 8 pixels, but if you end up with 10 pixels, that's okay. And if it shrinks down and you end up with 6 pixel space, that's also okay. So, you want an average of 8 pixel space between here, 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 and here. And there's actually a tool that you can use in Maya to measure out kind of where you are, just to get kind of a reference point here. So if you open up the UV toolkit, expand that guy, and you go down to arrange and layout, and you click the measure tool. It pops open this little window here, which is neat. And this guy will measure the pixel space between two selected UV points. So if we select these guys here and we click recalculate, you'll see in a 2K map, they are currently 2 pixels along, or close to 3 pixels along U and 42 pixels along V. So basically what that means is along U horizontally, you can see they're almost lined up. And so they're just like 2.5 pixels. And then vertically, they're way too many. They're 42.6 pixels. So that's like way too far, right? We're targeting 8 and 8 here. So this is a good way when you're just kind of working with UV layouts and practicing to kind of see how your stuff is actually kind of padding out. It's a good test to run the layout tool, type in 8 pixels and 8 pixels, run it, and then just grab a couple and calculate them and see how they come out. Like, let's measure these two here. Select those guys. So that one is 50 pixels horizontally and only 5 pixels vertically. And I have a trick that when I first got into 3D modeling, I always had a hard time remembering what U and V meant, like which one was horizontal and which one was vertical. And basically how I've remembered this is V is vertical. So if you just remember V, then you know what U is. So U is horizontal and V for vertical. So I always work backwards. I go, oh, V, okay, vertical. So that means U is horizontal. And another really interesting thing to point out about this tool is because, like we mentioned earlier, UVs are kind of in like vector space, like infinite space. They're procedural, but your texture is in pixel space. So it's not. So this tool will actually show you like these two pixels are 50 pixels apart, and that's very wasteful. But in a 4K map, they're actually 100 pixels apart because there's more pixels, but the UVs don't update as you apply different textures. So if you think about it that way, if you're working with 4K maps and even at 8 pixels apart, that's actually going to be double. It's actually going to be much more on a 4K map. But I find 8 pixels is a great compromise between texture bleed and UV space wastage. So I would always target 8. And primarily I work with 2K maps. And when I work with 4K maps, I still pad out to be 8 in a 2K map, if that makes sense. So this stuff should be way closer together. So here, I'm just going to like do a quick thing here and straighten these guys out. Those guys straight, just for a little test here, just for fun. We'll straighten these guys out, straighten these guys out. And then let's just measure this here. Okay, so yeah, we have 0, so that's great. And then V, we're looking at 40. So it's actually like way tighter, way tighter, way tighter. Yeah, it's like I'm still at 15. So I can't even do it on this texture because the way that I've done the texture. But basically, whoops, there we go. We're getting close. Basically, somewhere around, there we go, 8.9. Good enough. So somewhere around there is about the space that you're looking for in a 2K map. So that's it. Keep your UV percent usage to 70% minimum, but always aim for higher. And keep your texture padding to 8 pixels on average. But if you end up with some shells that are padded 6 and some shells that are padded to 10, that's okay too. If you like this video and want to see more game art tips and tricks, please click the subscribe button. As usual, any links will be in the description. If you got any questions, post them in the comments area. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a phenomenal day.